From Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. This is Chapter 6, Pig and Pepper. For a minute or two, she stood looking at the house and wondering what to do next, when suddenly a footman in livery came running out of the wood. She considered him to be a footman because he was in livery, otherwise, judging by his face only, she would have called him a fish, and rapped loudly on the door with his knuckles. It was opened by another footman in livery with a round face and large eyes, like a frog. Both footmen, Alice noticed, had powdered hair and curled all over their heads. She felt very curious to know what it was all about and crept a little way up from the wood to have a listen. The fish footman began by producing under his arm a great letter, excuse me, nearly as large as himself, and this he handed over to the other, saying in a solemn tone, "For the Duchess, an invitation from the Queen to play croquet." The frog footman repeated in the same solemn tone, only changing the order of the words a little. "From the Queen, an invitation for the Duchess to play croquet." They both bowed low, and the curls got entangled together. Alice laughed so much at this that she had to run back into the wood for fear of them hearing her. And when she peeped out next, the fish footman was gone, and the other was sitting on the ground next to the door, staring stupidly up into the sky. Alice went timidly up to the door and knocked. "There's no sort of use in knocking," said the footman, "and for that there are two reasons. First, because I'm on the same side of the door as you are, and secondly, because they're making such a noise inside, no one could possibly hear you." And certainly there was a most extraordinary noise going on within, a constant howling and sneezing, and every now and then a great crash, as if a dish or a kettle was being broken into pieces. "Please then, Alice, how am I to get in?" "There might be some sense in your knocking," said the footman, without attending to her, "if we had a door between us. For instance, if you were inside, you might knock, and I could let you out, you know." He was still looking up in the sky all the time as he was speaking, and this Alice thought was decidedly uncivil. "But perhaps he can't help it," she said to herself. His eyes were so very nearly at the top of his head, and at any rate he might answer questions. "How am I to get in?" she repeated aloud. "I shall sit here," the footman remarked, "till tomorrow." At this moment the door At this moment, the door of the house opened, and a large plate came skimming out, straight at the footman's head. It just grazed his nose, and broke into pieces against one of the trees behind him. "Or maybe the next day, maybe," the footman continued in the same tone, exactly as if nothing had happened. "How am I to get in?" asked Alice again, in a louder tone. "Are you to get in at all?" the footman said. "That's the first question, you know." It was no doubt, only Alice did not look like to be told so. "It's really dreadful," she muttered to herself. "All the way the creatures argue, it's enough to drive one crazy." The footman seemed to think there was a good opportunity for repeating his remark with variations. "I shall sit here on and off for days and days." "But what am I to do?" said Alice. "Anything you like," said the footman, and began whistling. "Well, there's no use in talking to him," Alice said Alice desperately. "He's perfectly idiotic." And she opened the door and went in. The door led right into a large kitchen, which was full of smoke from one end to the other. The Duchess was sitting on a three-legged stool in the middle, nursing a baby, and the cook was leaning over the fire, stirring a large cauldron, which seemed to be full of soup. "There's certainly too much pepper in that soup," said Alice to herself, as she could for sneezing. There was certainly much of it in the air. Even the Duchess sneezed occasionally, and for the baby it was sneezing and howling alternately without a moment's pause. The only two creatures in the kitchen that did not sneeze were the cook and the large cat, which had been lying at the hearth, grinning from ear to ear. "Please, would you tell me," said Alice, a little timidly, for she was not quite sure whether it was good manners to speak first, "why your cat grins like that?" "It's a Cheshire cat," said the Duchess, "and that's why." "Pig!" She said the last word in a sudden violence that caught Alice quite jumped, but then she saw another moment it was addressing to the baby, and not to her. So she took the courage and went again. "I didn't know that Cheshire cats always grinned. In fact, I didn't know a cat could grin." "They all can," said the Duchess, "and most of them do." "I don't know any that do," said Alice very politely, feeling quite pleased to have got into a conversation. "Then you don't know much," said the Duchess, "and that's a fact." Alice did not like the tone of this remark, and thought it would be as well to introduce some other subject of conversation. While she was trying to fix on one, the cook took the cauldron of soup from the fire, and once to work, throwing everything within her reach at the Duchess and the baby. Fire irons came first, then followed by a shower of saucepans, plates, dishes. The Duchess took no notice of them, even when they hit her, and the baby was howling so much already it was quite impossible to say whether the blows hurt it or not. "Oh, please, would you mind what you're doing?" cried Alice, jumping up and down in agony of terror. "Oh, there goes his precious nose!" And an unusually large saucepan close by it nearly carried it off. "If everyone minded their own business," said the Duchess in a hoarse growl, "the world would go on a great deal faster than it does now." "And which would not be an advantage," said Alice, and was quite very glad to get an opportunity of showing off the little of her knowledge. "Just think about what works it would make with day and night. You see, the earth takes 24 hours to turn on its axis." "Talking of axes," said the Duchess, "chop off her head." Alice glanced rather anxiously at the cook to see if she meant to take the hint, but the cook was busily stirring the soup and seemed not to be listening, and so she went on again. 24 hours, I think it is. Or is it 12? Oh, don't bother me," said the Duchess. "I never could abide by figures." And then she began nursing the child again, singing a sort of lullaby to it as she did, and giving a violent shake at the every line. "Speak roughly to your little boy and beat him when he sneezes. He only does it to annoy because he knows it teases." Then the chorus struck up in which the baby and the cook joined in. Wow, wow, wow. And while the Duchess sang the second verse of the song, she kept tossing the baby violently up and down, and the poor little thing howled so that Alice could hardly hear the words. "I speak severely to my boy, and I beat him when he sneezes, for he can thoroughly enjoy the pepper when he pleases. Wow, wow, wow." "Here, you may nurse it a bit if you like," said the Duchess to Alice, flinging the baby to her as she spoke. "I must go and get ready to play croquet with the Queen." And she hurried out of the room. The cook threw a flying pan at her as she went, but just missed her. Alice caught the baby with some difficulty, as it was a queer-shaped little creature and held out its arms and legs in all directions. "Just like a starfish," thought Alice. And the poor little thing was snorting like a steam engine when she caught it, and she kept doubling itself up and straightening itself out again, so that altogether for the first minute or two it was as much as she could do to hold on to it. As soon as she made her out the proper way of nursing it, which was to twist it into some sort of a knot, and then keep tight hold of its right ear and left foot so as to prevent it from undoing itself, she carried it out into the open air. "If I don't take this child away with me," thought Alice, "they're sure to kill it in a day or two. Wouldn't it be murder to leave it behind?" She said these last words aloud, and the little thing grunted to reply. It had left off sneezing by this time. "Don't grunt," said Alice. "That's not at all the proper way of expressing yourself." The baby grunted again, and Alice looked very anxiously at its face to see what was the matter with it. There could be no doubt that it had a very turned up nose, much more like a snout than a real nose, and its eyes were getting extremely small for a baby altogether. Alice did not like the look of things at all. "Perhaps it's only when it's sobbing," she thought, and she looked into its eyes again to see if there were any tears. No, there were no tears. "If you're going to turn into a pig, my dear," said Alice very seriously, "I'll have nothing more to do with you. Mind now." The little pig sobbed again, or grunted, it was impossible to say which, and then they went on for some while in silence. Alice was just beginning to think to herself, "Now what am I going to do with this creature when I get home?" when it grunted again so violently that she looked down at its face in some alarm. This time there could be no mistake. It was neither more nor less a pig, and she felt it quite absurd to be carrying around it any further. So she let the creature down, and felt quite relieved to see it trot away quietly into the wood. "If it had grown up," she said to herself, "it would have made a dreadfully ugly child. But it makes a rather handsome pig, I think." And she began thinking over other children she knew, and how they might do well as pigs, and was just saying to herself, "If one only knew the right way to change them." And then she was a little startled, seeing the Chester cat sitting off in a bough of a tree a few yards away. The cat only grinned when it saw Alice. It looked good-natured, and she thought, and still had very long claws and a great many teeth, so she felt that she ought to be treated with respect. "Cheshire Puss," she began rather timidly, as she did not know whether to call what name to call it. However, it only grinned a little wider. Come, it's pleased so far, thought Alice, when she went on. Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go home? That depends a great deal on where you want to get to, said the cat. I don't care much where, said Alice. Then it doesn't matter which way you go, said the cat, so long as I go somewhere. Alice asked for it added as an explanation. Oh, you're sure to do that, said the Cheshire Cat, if you only walk long enough. Alice felt she could not be denied, so she tried another question. What sort of people live about here? In that direction, the cat said, waving its right paw around, lives a hatter, and in that direction, waving the other paw, lives a March hare. Visit either if you like. They're both mad. But I don't want to be among mad people, Alice remarked. Oh, you can't help that, said the cat. We're all mad here. I'm mad. You're mad. How do you know I'm mad? Said Alice. You must be, or you wouldn't have come here. Alice didn't think that proved it at all. However, she went on, and how do you know that you're mad? To begin with, a dog's not mad. You grant that. I suppose so, said Alice. Well, then, the cat went on, you see, a dog growls when it's angry and wags its tail when it's pleased. Now, I growl when I'm pleased and wag my tail when I'm angry. Therefore, I'm mad. I call it purring, not growling, said Alice. Call it what you like, said the cat. Do you play croquet with the Queen today? I should like it very much, said Alice, but I haven't been invited yet. You'll see me there, said the cat, and vanished. Alice was not surprised at this, for she was getting so well used to queer things happening. While she was still looking at the place where it had been, it suddenly appeared again. By the by, what became of the baby? Said the cat. I'd nearly forgotten to ask. It turned into a pig, Alice answered very quietly, just as if the cat had come back in a natural way. I thought it would, the cat said, and vanished again. Alice waited a little while, half expecting to see it again, but it did not reappear, and after a minute or two she walked in the direction that the March hare was said to live. I've seen hatters before, she said to herself. The March hare will be much more interesting, and perhaps, as this is May, it won't be raving mad, at least not so mad as it was in March. And with this, she looked up, and there was the cat again, sitting on a branch of a tree. Did you say a pig or a fig? Said the cat. I said a pig, replied Alice. I wish you wouldn't keep appearing and vanishing so suddenly. You make one quite giddy. All right, said the cat, and this time it vanished quite slowly, beginning with the end of its tail and ending with a grin, which remained for some time after the rest of it had gone. Well, I've often seen a cat without a grin, but a grin without a cat. That's the most curious thing I've ever seen in all my life. She had not gone much further, before she came in sight of a house of the March hare. She thought it must be the right house because the chimneys were shaped like ears, and the roof of the house was thatched with fur. It was so large a house that she did not like to go nearer until she nibbled some more of her left hand bit at the mushroom, and it raised herself about 2 feet high. Even then, she walked toward the house rather timidly, saying to herself, "Suppose it should be raving mad after all. I almost wish I had gone to see the Hatter instead."